Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. So we are back with the APIM Hotrod. Yeah, Stefan, how are you?
Fine, Massimo, and you?
Not too bad.
Not good, good,
Yes.
good.
Okay,
So,
so today, so last time we talked about GraphQL with Tone, our first external guest. So it was a pleasure. And today we go back to a topic that, yeah, it comes a lot of time with API management. It was also a request from one of our viewers, and which is always nice. So today we will talk about versions and revisions in API management, but and also a little bit about versions in general, right, Stefan?
indeed, that's a common question. Indeed, what is the difference between versions and revisions? When to use what? So I think indeed makes sense to talk about it a little bit, right? But I know you have some slides to show, right,
Yeah,
Massimo?
just a little bit of support material here to help the discussion or to visualize. I
Yeah.
hope is readable. So yeah, should I start? You start, Stefan?
Oh, no,
Doesn't
you can start, Massimo. I'll just ask
okay.
questions when it makes
Yeah.
sense.
Okay. So actually, here on the right, we have the main difference between version and revision. So normally the version, when you version your API, and then there are different way of versioning, but you let your mainly your consumer decide when to adopt your API. Depend your version, your specific version, depending which kind of functionality you are exposing via that version. So I might have the version 1 to make it very simple, and then in the version 2 I cover a new scenario. So I support, for example, both, and I let my user decide, okay, which one fits his scenario. So the way to do versioning most of the time with REST API is using the path versioning, the header versioning, and query string versioning. We will see later more in details to visualize. So as this slide is saying, I might have different versions at the same time, 1, 2, or 3, or by date, by semantic versioning, whatever style we want to use. But again, our consumer decide, okay, I use this version or the other one. Where if I sunset, if I deprecate a version, then I need to give, like enough time to my customer to jump into the next version or the version that they like. So there is a lot of things to keep in mind before, I mean, dismiss or
Yeah.
retire a version. But that's what it's about. So why we do versioning, so we have backward compatibilities. We can experiment on a new version if we want. This kind of thing. So we can give stabilities to our consumers, and we can change in a controlled way. That basically revisions in API management is something that is built on top of versions. So it's not some. So while version is standard for, let's say, for is a common concept for every API, revisions is something introduced by API management and other, for example, API manager tools. And over there, it allows you to implement some changes on your API, some non-breaking changes, create a sort of side-by-side version, or in this case, it's called a revision. An example is like I have my version 1, I can create a revision from the version 1, change on that revision a policy to test a different behavior. I can test side by side both both revisions, the original and the new one, and then at a given time decide to swap them, mm, and uh, and bring online the new version, and sorry, the new revision,
Revision. Yeah.
and take
Yeah.
offline. So it gives a sort of a side by side. It gives also the possibility to roll back from one to the other, and this is just like with a little configuration.
Yeah, so maybe typical use case is the bug fix, right? So say that you have identified a bug, you need to fix it, of course. You can create a revision just to test your bug fix. For instance, make sure as well that you did not introduce a new bug by just trying to fix the the other ones. And then indeed, so we have the concept of current revision, and then any new revision, of course, that you add is for you to test. And then indeed, you can target that. You'll show that later, Massimo, in the URL and so on. And basically, once you are quite sure about your changes, you can promote the new revision as the current one. So that's a bit the goal of using revisions.
Can we say that that is just to allow test in production if you want, or it's a sort of blue-green approach?
Yeah, allow testing, and indeed, at some point, if you say that you don't have breaking changes, so that's why I mentioned bug fix could also be something, not especially bug fix, but maybe something that you intended to include as part of, let's say, the original features, and maybe you forgot something, so it's not really a bug fix per se, but you want to still that functionality that's non-breaking part of the current version. You would first create revisions, indeed test it, and then once you're completely sure that it's okay, you promote it as the current revision, which then becomes or is then used by all the ones who are consuming the current version, right?
But
So
yeah,
that's a bit,
but
yeah,
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 but just to keep it, in that show, we always try to have some anecdotes or some customer question bringing back to the show. For example, one time a customer of mine asked me, "Okay, Massimo, I understand this, so it's to do this testing, bug fixing, but I have different environment, development, test, acceptance, production. I Acceptance, for example, is the environment where I test my changes. So should I use a revision? Yes or no? Does a revision brings to me any added value? So what is your opinion in this?
yeah. Well, I would say still yes, because somehow, as you mentioned, you can always roll back. So, for instance, say that I mean, if you have your four environments, you could, of course, somehow roll back the previous current version by redeploying. You see what I mean? The previous version of the pipeline. But with revisions, it's a bit. I would you could more or less make the analogy with deployment slots with app service. So the same environment, right? For the same compute in this case can be used, and then you can swap slots. And if you still identify an issue that is only and you only identify that in production, yet you have the possibility to revert. And so I would say with revisions a bit the same, right? If you in the end indeed you have all your environments, but sometimes maybe something you just spotted in production, that can always happen, then at least this revision could be offers you a possibility to roll back very fast, instead of
Yeah,
redeploying, let's say, and overwriting the current revision that you have. So that's one benefit. But indeed, other than this, indeed, if you have the traditional DTAP, the goal is that you try to make it bulletproof before you reach production.
yeah,
uh,
and as you know, in IT, the answer is always it always it depends,
yeah,
and it depends in this case also which kind of audience do you have in that specific environment, as you were mentioning. So suppose that I'm acceptance or testing is the environment that I want to use, or I'm using, if there is a lot of load, a lot of audience in that things, and even in that environment, I want to limit the
yeah,
impact to that
impact,
audience.
yeah,
Suppose
indeed,
during you have to go to production with a new release in a couple of weeks, and that test environment is untouchable, or that
yeah,
acceptance is untouchable, but you want anyway to have an additional test
yeah,
to understand, to
yeah.
validate the small
Yeah,
changes.
somehow you can indeed isolate your work and then indeed not impact the others. That is indeed a good reason, of course. That even non-pod, it doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want, because even in non-pod you might impact others being developers or indeed testers, and even
And
sometimes
and
business
why
users.
this is, just maybe I skip on the other slide, then we go back. This is possible because those revisions are available at the same time, so it's not
Yeah,
one or the others. So are
indeed.
both of them. There is no matter which version scheme are you going to use, there will be a revision that is part of your path. So at the same time, you
Yeah,
you can access to the two kind of
yeah,
configurations, runtime
yeah.
configuration you do have.
Yeah, and it's worth mentioning that, of course, if you omit the revision, then it's gonna be the current one by default. So
Yes,
yeah,
which is very important for user. Actually, very that is very important for user impact, and it comes back. Uh, it's very important things when it's about, I believe, versioning strategy. Let's just take a few minutes about how we can version an API. Because that's one of the main difference between the URL versioning and, if you want, query string versioning, where in URL path versioning, is the most used. At least 98% of the time in my case, I see that kind of path versioning. But one of the negative things of that path versioning, if you have too many versions, then the path changes too much. And that's the case of the path versioning. For URL, the query string versioning, you just, like the example of Microsoft ARM APIs, you just the URL, it does not change, it's always the same. The version is a parameter at the end of your is a query string parameter that makes sure that your main URL.
But somehow it's part of your, so the FQDN doesn't change, but somehow if you don't change your query string anyway, you would still be targeting the old one. You see what I mean? So you will impact your consumers anyway, right, Massimo? Because you said it doesn't change, but just to try to understand what you mean there.
No, what I mean is, like, the base address is always the same. It's a parameter. I mean, it's a little difference here. It doesn't. It's not day and night stuff. But it's your base path. It is the same every time, right? It's important that if you don't, I believe it's important that you don't specify a version. There is no default version. I hate.
That's indeed, because that's where you bounce. So I just wanted to see. Yeah, indeed. So if you don't specify a version, then you would have typically a 404.
In this case. I bounce on that. Thank you, Stefan, that you stopped me on this. I bounce on that default version because I hate the first version. And honestly, I do believe that if you are using query parameter versioning and you do implement a default versioning, you are doing something very wrong. It should be explicit. If you don't specify that parameter, you have like 404, for example, these kind of things.
Yeah, and by the way, I still see some companies that do not use versioning at all, and that I would say it's a mistake. You should always use versioning. Because you can still create APIs without versioning. But I would say, even if you plan to only have one, right, and you're sure it will never change. But first, anyway, it's not, it's free to use versions, and at least you are future-proof, because if one day you indeed still have another version, then you will prevent, or you will manage more the impact and towards consumption and so on. So it's always
exactly. Yeah. So here on the right, we put on the top an example of MongoDB API that they are using the path versioning. In the middle, we have the one of if you're working with Azure, you normally use those versioning with query string tons of time every day. And then at the bottom, there is the other, what I believe, less used way of doing versioning with a header, or if you want a media type. But that, if you're using a media type, like the example here, you can, I don't know if it's readable, the example of Capital One, they're using a media type, in this case, application JSON v1. They're using the default application JSON, but then they attach the version on that content type, or you might have your own media type. That it makes it's nice thing. So you somehow you version your data, your object, if you want. But the thing is, I always found this very complex for the consumer. You need a consumer more, let's say, ready for this. I mean, capable of managing these kind of things. And also, then you have to make sure that you don't get crazy between content type and accept headers. So I send a content type, and if I accept a different version, well, I mean, Does it even, do you have to support this scenario? Do you have to return an error? So you really go into too much complexity, according to me, for to manage versioning. But okay, it's a very opinionated topic, so everybody think differently, right?
I agree. Yeah. So for me, indeed, it's also the first one that I see the most used, at least with APIM. Yeah. But indeed, so you have all these three possibilities. Yeah. So did you have another slide, Massimo, about?
But
Yeah.
I just there is another question that came to my mind before moving to another slide. So in API management, when you create an API, you can say, I want to create an API using a using a versions, if you want, and
Yeah.
without using a version.
Yeah.
So you can say, I'm not using the version, but then adding the version like as header, as a parameter, and things like this. So it's a very little thing. So you can use versions without using the built-in version in API management. But maybe by saying this, I'm adding confusion.
No, no. Okay, it's comprehensive. Indeed, that's possible. But indeed, I would try then to leverage a built-in one. So if you really plan to use versioning, try to leverage building one so that you don't need to come with any secret sauce or whatsoever, or indeed tackle the typically in APIM, if you have one version and you use the versioning system, then you will have one facade API, right, that is anyway linked to a backend. And then if you have multiple versions at a time, they should target, of course, different backends here, because that's also sometimes ideally, right, it's also something that is sometimes confusing for people. They don't always realize that, okay, if you have V1, 2, 3 at level of APIM, that indeed behind the scenes, it means that these guys are going to V1, 2, 3 also of your backend. So either you could say, and it could work, but it's not a good idea. You could say, okay, uh, the same backend instance would be able to handle, you see, the three versions, but then you would need some sort of logic to see, okay, are they targeting V3, V1, V3? For me, the easiest is really to have different backend versions as well and keep a 1-1 mapping to make sure that you don't indeed introduce complexity. Of course, it will potentially consume a little more compute, because of course these 1, 2, 3 versions will indeed have a footprint if they use different worker processes, or if you use pod, for instance, if you're in AKS, each pod will use some CPU and memory, but I think it's worthwhile to do it this way to avoid extra complexity, let's say. I don't know your opinion about this,
No,
Massimo.
no, I agree with this, and also, especially when you said that to use versioning since the day one, that's also important. So all the logs behind will have versioning already since the day one. So it will be very good also for your reporting strategies or whatever data you want then to surface to your users. So if it is there, so let's leverage the things.
Yeah,
And
indeed. And that
as you say,
logging
like
data. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Massimo. Sorry.
no, I was closing. I just say to have multiple backends, keep it simple. That's of course, the first approach. If that makes sense for you, let's start simple. You always have time to make it more complex.
Yeah, indeed. And the logging, that's also a good point, because then, of course, if you plan to deprecate a version at some point, you can also rely on your log data to see how often it is used, right? So, and then if you see that indeed you have like two versions in parallel, and the first version is only used by 5% of the customers, then it gives you concrete numbers about, it's less and less used. So at some point you can announce a deprecation and then remove it, for instance, right? And then, of course, remove the corresponding backend as well. Yeah.
And I have just because we are in the topic of versions, is a discussion for I had some weeks ago with some expert in the API space and some colleagues. Let's say it's in general about versioning, but in this case is applied to OpenAPI, not GraphQL, not any other things, but it's just really how to manage versioning in the OpenAPI specification. And here there are 3 pointers because sometimes it happens that the customer and colleagues they confuse what you have in the info.version field So that is not the version of the OpenAPI specification, which in this case is 301. Okay,
Yeah.
is not the version of the API, because if you look at the bottom in this slide, there is an example. This is coming from a Swiss bank example. They are using the versioning in the path, the path segment, V1. You see V1 payment service. Now, the V1 is very different than what you find in the at the bottom, which is 1.3.4 and then underscore the date. So that version is the version of your description, API description. In this case, is the version of the Swagger, and that might change when you change this description, when you add a different sample request, sample response. It doesn't mean that you have really a breaking change in or any change in your API. It might be aligned. It might be if I have V1 in the path, also my first semver is aligned somehow to do not trigger confusion in your consumer. But what I wanted to say in this, that the API version that we were talking today, in the OpenAPI specification, we don't have a field to really describe the version, and the version is like in the header, in the query string, or in the segment URI. So it's everywhere. If you want to specify, you have to leverage, for example, an extension. If you want to make it explicit, what is the version? So this I found, I put it here, Stefan, because I found interesting to every now and then refresh this to make sure that it's important that companies has also standard in how they put the version of the
Yeah.
OpenAPI specification.
Yeah. No, indeed, it's a good thing, Massimo. Yeah, indeed, it can be confusing for some people. So yeah, I think
Because
it's
there
good.
also the number 4 version, there is also the version of your code. And I
Yeah.
saw people using the version of code inside the OpenAPI specification, which is could be somehow also a security leak
Yeah.
consideration.
Yeah. Something that you should not do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, indeed. Good. I think, is there anything we forgot, Massimo, about? Okay, maybe quick summary. New versions for breaking changes. Always use versions. That's the takeaway number one. New versions only when you have breaking changes or you want to purposely monetize. Maybe that could be another reason. Like, okay, you don't have a breaking change, but you introduce new functionalities and you want people to pay for. And that would be then, because then you can bundle that in different products and so on, and then let people subscribe to the products of their choice. Could be another reason. And then use revisions for testing, basically, a quick ability to roll back in case of issue, even including in production. Yeah, I think that's a bit a summary, right, Massimo? And of
Yeah,
course, then pay attention to your Open API spec and the file that Massimo just showed.
yeah.
Yeah, minute
It's,
ago.
I think that's it. So it's a very interesting, always interesting topic, versioning, and also the deprecation of a version. So I hope we cover this topic. If you guys, if you have any topic that you would like us
To discuss,
to
yeah.
discuss, so please let us know. And voila, so we are at the end of the episode. Stefan, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Massimo, and talk to you soon for our next episode. See you
Bye
guys.
bye.
Bye.